Today, we're diving deep into a story that's as mysterious as the ocean's depths. We're talking about the Titanic director James Cameron and how he had a near-death experience on a submersible in 1995 while exploring the wreckage for his blockbuster movie about the shipwreck. Unlike Oceangate submersible, he dived 2.5 miles straight down deeper than the Titanic herself lies, where the pressure can crush a sub in an instant, where unknown currents can sweep you away into oblivion. James Cameron took that journey. And what happened on his trip to the bottom will blow your mind, so come along into the shadows. It's time to descend into the deep. Cameron shared the experience in a 2009 biography titled The Futurist by Rebecca Keegan. Cameron has made dozens of trips to visit the Titanic shipwreck, said that he almost lost his life during an underwater sandstorm, undercutting the consistent danger that the deep dives pose. The Avatar director has been an outspoken figure after 5 people died while trying to reach the Titanic on Oceangate's Titan submersible. So let's start the story. On the morning of September 8, 1995, Cameron folded his long limbs into the 7-foot-wide cockpit of Mir 1, next to Sagalovich and a Russian engineer. The 3 men would share the claustrophobic quarters for the next 14 hours on their journey to Titanic and back. About the length of a flight from New York to Tokyo, this trip would include no cocktail service or reclining seats, and the bathroom was a plastic bag, which the Russians took pride in never needing. Cameron conserved his energy on the ride to the bottom, napping, reading, and gazing out the small viewport window as the water outside darkened from green to blue. By 900 feet, it was completely black. Just 11,600 more to go. At the surface, the air in the sub had been hot and humid, but as they descended it grew colder, eventually reaching just above freezing. The men layered on extra clothes they had packed, drank some tea, and began to prepare for their landing. Once they reached the bottom, they located the wreck using sonar, a new type the Russian pilot was still learning to use. Sitting in the pitch darkness, they knew Titanic was ahead of them, somewhere. The Mir was roughly the size of a cement mixer, and Sagalovich was piloting it by looking out a window 6 inches in diameter. There was no way to see behind them, to the sides or above, and they were maneuvering near an enormous wreck, a mass of twisted, jagged steel and draped cables, traps that could snag the sub and pin them to the bottom of the ocean until they suffered a lingering demise by hypothermia. The constant threat of imminent death, incidentally, made the dive terribly fun for Cameron. First they came upon a mound of clay taller than the sub. Sagalovich rose up to climb over the mound, and the silt from the thrusters swirled around the ports, blocking their view. When the silt cleared, Cameron got his first look at the Titanic, a black wall of steel, covered in rivets, coming straight at him about 10 feet ahead. They were too close, moving too fast. Sagalovich hit full thrust back and up, and sediment again swirled in front of the viewport. Cameron braced himself for a crash, but instead the Mir sailed over a guardrail right onto the deck of the ship. The pilot set the sub down gingerly, and everyone froze. They looked at one another, stunned. They were sitting on top of Titanic. They had seen the ship just in time to avert a head-on collision. This is when I realized that deep ocean wreck diving was not a precise science, Cameron says. His memorization of the wreck from studying diagrams, deck plans, and the practice model came in handy immediately. I was like an astronaut landing on the moon, he says. I had prepared and trained myself for the moment so rigorously that I knew the layout of the wreck cold. When the silt cleared, he was able to discern that they were on the port aft end of the forecastle, looking out over the forward well deck, facing aft on the port side. Sagalovich lifted up and they started to explore. In the Mir's lights, Cameron looked out the viewport at the very spot on the deck where the band had played Nearer My God to Thee as the water rose over the rails. It was like a dream, he says. I was so pumped and adrenalized and goal-oriented that I immediately turned to filming the wreck. He was working from a shot list that required the other sub, Mir 2, to get in precise positions and rake its lights over the decks or the hull, so they went to work. No time for sightseeing. It wasn't until Cameron was back on the Keldysh, safe in his cabin that night, that he began to grasp that he had just sailed through the coffin of 1,517 people. He started to shake, and tears came to his eyes. The enormity of the tragedy, the loss of life, the horror of what it must have been like hit me, Cameron says. It was a deeply emotional place, but my reaction was delayed. I made a vow to myself at that moment to stop being an astronaut and to honor the place and the event by making time on every dive to take the wreck in. There would be 11 more dives before the expedition was finished. Eventually, Cameron couldn't resist the opportunity to take Snoop Dogg inside the wreck. Roving around inside the bones of the great ship, He saw once luxurious suites overgrown with deep-sea animals, a woodwork fireplace, with a crab crawling over the hearth, silt streaming through intricate bronze grille doors. The footage would be used not only for the present-day recreation of the Titanic wreck, but also for the period Titanic. It set a level of excellence for the rest of the movie, Cameron says. Sets and costumes had to live up to the example set by visiting the real wreck. The worst of the dives came to be known as the bottom storm. On Cameron's third trip down to Titanic, an unusually rapid current swirled the sediment, dropping visibility to less than 10 feet and shoving the Mir around like a pebble at the beach. Sea stars bounced across the ocean floor like tumbleweeds. The veteran Mir pilot had never seen the odd and dangerous conditions before. It was like a sandstorm at the bottom of the ocean, but Cameron still wanted to shoot. At $40,000 per dive, he couldn't conceive of wasting the trip. The poor visibility prevented him from filming any wide shots, but he could capture close-ups of anchors and portholes. At one point, the turbulence kicked up so strongly that it blew the nickel-steel sub right off the wreck and set it down more than 100 yards from the ship. The sub had landed in the lee of Titanic, which shielded it from the current, so the Mir 1 crew could idle on the bottom and ponder what to do next while Segalovich held them in place with the thrusters. They had been utterly focused on jockeying around the wreck in the storm and not watching their power levels, which had been drained due to the extreme conditions. Anatoly said, "Oh no," something you never want to hear a pilot say, and we locked eyes for a second, Cameron recalls. Then each began shutting down power to his respective systems. They needed to abort the dive immediately, and the pilot started pumping ballast with what remained of the power. As the sub lightened, it rose sluggishly, the wee-chung noise of its power winding down. Finally, Mir 1 gave a last feeble cough and stopped. They were rising at only a few feet per minute and dead out of power. Cameron saw the bottom falling away with agonizing slowness. At this speed, Mir 1 might need 10 hours to ascend, but at least they were going up. When they reached 80 feet from the bottom, however, the sub stopped and started to descend again. "I thought, what the fuck? That's not supposed to happen," Cameron says. They bumped back down on the ocean floor. Stuck 2 miles from the surface in a storm, the Mir crew thought the battery might get enough of a bounce to run the ballast pump a little if it was given a break. So they sat in the dark, waiting, no one saying a word for half an hour. It seemed entirely possible Titanic was about to claim another 3 victims. Eventually, the pilot tested the pump. It groaned a few weak strokes and then quit, but they started to rise again. Curiously, at 80 feet again they stopped, falling back to the bottom with a clunk. They sat for another half hour and tried again. What the Mir 1 crew didn't know was that they were in a kind of downdraft caused by the current blowing over the huge shipwreck. Each time they rose, they would hit the downdraft and get thrown back to the bottom, but each time they were blown a little farther from the wreck. On the third try, Cameron held his breath as they got to 80 feet and slowed, and then kept rising. Soon their rate sped up a bit, though they were still travelling at snail's pace. A normal ascent would have taken them 2.5 hours from that depth. At this rate, they would reach the surface in about 10 hours. It was going to be a long, cold, dark return. Segalovich started pulling up the floor of the sub. He reached his arm down in the darkness and grabbed a handle. "Maybe we should release some emergency ballast," Cameron recalls the pilot saying. "What? We have emergency ballast, and we'd had it all along." The Russian pilot said, "Yes, by all means, let's drop some emergency ballast." They began to rise a little faster. It would be only 5 hours to the surface. And that was our story today about James Cameron and his terrifying experience. This story was from his book, The Futurist. If you like it, drop me a comment below and I will make another story from this book. This one is full of very scary and interesting stories like this one. Imagine that this happened to the people died in the Oceangate accident and they faced all this dark, sad feeling before they died. Check the videos I made before about Oceangate and their evil creator. Thank you and see you in the next video. Peace.